All right, so today we're going to talk about our safe starches and why we call them safe. Our safe starches are part of our carbohydrate food group. And I just want to acknowledge how proud I am that we are not considered a low carb organization. We do see a value in going low carb periodically and using it as a tool, but we also see a value in having carbohydrates from real food sources as long as we follow our rules. Because first of all, we have some sanity because we have carbohydrates in the diet. Also, there's a unique nutrient profile that we're getting from these real food sources of carbohydrates. And then also we want to take advantage of the insulin sensitivity that we're working so hard to create through being strategic with our carbohydrates and nurturing space in between meals and strategic fasting. All right, but the reason that we call our safe starches safe is because number one, we acknowledge there's a difference between starch and sugar. Number two, they're cooked in the appropriate fats. And then number three, they are relatively clean and pure and void of what we would consider anti-nutrients. So I want to touch on each one of those three topics. So first of all, let's talk about the difference between starch and sugar. Starch is technically chains of glucose tied together, varying lengths of chains of glucose tied together. So when I digest starch, I break it down and I have a bunch of glucose that my body can then use or store. All right, the difference between starch and sugar is that sugar is part glucose and part fructose. And from an experiential standpoint, the difference that I taste is that something that is sugary is something that is sweet, and that sweet component is the fructose. So fructose is the differentiating factor between starch and sugar. So I already mentioned when we eat something that's predominantly starch-based, we're going to break that down and we have a bunch of glucose. Glucose is something that every cell in my body is familiar with. So every cell in my body can use that glucose that I digest, but at some point my body can only use so much glucose at once, and so the rest of it is going to start to store. So it will convert glucose into glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose that it can put inside the muscles and liver, but I only have so much storage space for glycogen, so then anything in excess after that gets stored as body fat. And this happens over time. You know, if I have a big bowl of white rice in one evening, I'm not going to put the equivalent on in body fat, even though my body can't use that immediately and store all of it. But if I do that consistently, it predisposes my body to store that carbohydrate as body fat. All right, now, the difference between starch and sugar is that we have this fructose component. So when I eat something that's sugary, then I break that down and I have glucose, right? Because we already said that sugar is part glucose and part fructose. So we break that down. Now I have glucose and it goes through the same pathway. Every cell in my body can use it, but in excess it gets stored as glycogen, and in excess over that it gets stored as body fat. But then the fructose has to be metabolized by the liver. And so what we want to acknowledge here is that fructose adds an extra toxic burden to the body, and depending on how much we consume, depends on how much of a toxic burden that is. And it also starts to back up other processes that are happening. And actually, fructose takes the same metabolic pathway as ethanol alcohol. So you can think toxic burden when I consume fructose. And what I don't want us to take away from this is that it's bad to consume fruits and real food sources of sugar, but there is a difference between starch and sugar. If I look at the symptomology associated with chronic alcohol exposure, a lot of the symptoms match up with chronic fructose exposure. So in both we have high blood pressure, we have some heart problems, we have dyslipidemia or poor lipid numbers, we have pancreatitis, we have obesity, we have what we'd call damage to the liver from ethanol exposure, which would be cirrhosis of the liver, and then we have damage to the liver through fructose exposure, which would be fatty liver. All right, so a lot of those things match up. The thing that we don't get when we consume fructose is that inebriation or the buzz. All right, so there's a really good little documentary that's on YouTube called Skinny on Obesity, and Dr. Lustig goes through this whole explanation about fructose and how it's so damaging to the body, and I think that's a really good video for us to watch. We looked up some data, and if you had to predict the evolutionary consumption of fructose, we're looking at about 15 grams of fructose per day from fruits and vegetables, which would account for about 2% of our total calories. And then we looked at a dietary study, and this was the most recent one, was about 2018. The average per capita fructose consumption, meaning per man, woman, and child in the United States, was about 75 grams of fructose per day, and that accounted for about 13 to 14% of total calories. And if we broke that out into adolescents, we're looking at about 92 grams of fructose per day, because these kids are consuming so much sugar, and that's about 16% of total calories. And when you see kids and what they're consuming, you see people walking home from the gas station, they have Gatorades in their hand, they have Monster drinks and energy drinks and Coca-Colas and sodas, and then there's things that a lot of people consume they think is healthy that is loaded with sugar, things like orange juice and other fruit juices, and then also coconut water. All right, but the amount of fructose that we're consuming today is so different from what our bodies expect. This is one of the biggest problems that we're encountering with all of our different health problems. All right, so the most important point that I want us to take away from this is that starch is cleaner than sugar. Now, within the real food realm, if we're following our basic rules and being strategic with carbohydrates, I don't want people to be scared of consuming fruit. I just want us to be aware that starch is a little bit cleaner burning than something that's sugar-based because of that fructose component. And all things being equal, same measured out amounts, if I have the same amount of net carbs from starch compared to the same amount of net carbs from sugar, the starch is going to be a little bit cleaner, a little bit safer for the body. All right. Now, the second reason that we call our safe starches safe is because they're cooked in the appropriate fats. And one of our safe starches that's very popular out there, especially at fast food restaurants, is going to be white potatoes. So white potatoes get made into French fries, and the problem at most of these restaurants is that white potatoes are cooked in, or French fries are cooked in, the inappropriate fats and oils. Like usually it's going to be a vegetable oil, soybean oil, corn oil, or canola oil. All right, and these oils are completely toxic and very inflammatory to the body. So we just acknowledge the importance of having to cook our safe starches in the appropriate fats. And then also that means that we can cook our own safe starches in appropriate fats. So the most important point with this number 2 topic is that we always want to be aware of the fats and oils that our safe starches are cooked in, especially when we're eating out. All right, the third reason that we call our safe starches safe is because they are relatively clean and pure and void of what we call antinutrients. So plants create protection mechanisms inside themselves called antinutrients, or that we call antinutrients. And the reason they do that is because they can't run from danger. So they have to protect themselves and discourage being eaten by mammals. All right, and they especially protect their seeds because their seeds are their next generation. So within a seed, I may be able to analyze it and say that there's all these beneficial nutrients and fiber. Whole grain advocates would say in the shell, in the hull, in the husk, we have additional fiber and additional nutrients, but that doesn't take into account the anti-nutrients that are also contained in that. All right, so safe starches are relatively void of these anti-nutrients. And that's why we prefer white rice over brown rice. That's why hard-shelled nuts, we tend to prefer that nut inside, because the nut inside doesn't have all the protection, because the majority of that protection lies in that shell. Our safe starches are almost completely void of anti-nutrients, right? So again, the 3 main reasons that we call our safe starches safe is because we acknowledge there's a difference between starch and sugar. So safe starches are a little bit more safe and tolerable and less toxic to the body. So there's a difference between starch and sugar. There's no fructose in these safe starches, or relatively small amounts. And then also we acknowledge that we have to cook these safe starches in the appropriate fats. And then these safe starches are relatively clean and pure and void of what we would consider anti-nutrients. And our main safe starches are going to be sweet potatoes and yams, taro root, white rice over brown rice, cassava, which is also known as yuca, which also gets converted into tapioca, and then plantains. And then we could also throw in white potatoes, although white potatoes we have to be a little bit cautious about because they are considered a nightshade. Now, we borrowed this concept and made it our own from this book called The Perfect Health Diet, which was written by Paul Jaminet. Paul Jaminet is a paleo advocate, but he was one of the first nutritionists to kind of recommend that people consume carbohydrates and the importance of carbohydrates. He actually recommends with his clients and in his book that people consume up to 1 pound of safe starches per day. And he sees a lot of great results with his people. And I think the big takeaway from that is if we have this foundation of real food and we're eating within the real food realm, there's a lot of things that we can do to experiment, and we're most likely going to see beneficial results, especially if we're coming from the standard American diet. Now, a big question we get is how much safe starches is safe to consume? Well, we would say if you're eyeballing it, maybe looking at about a fistful as a maximum. All right, and this is your fistful, not your husband's fistful, not your boyfriend's fistful. But we think what is more ideal is going between 1/2 cup to 3/4 cup of prepared safe starches per evening, following our other guidelines. And we mentioned before, we do not want people to be scared of consuming fruit, because fruit is a real food. It's a real food source of sugar. We like to look at fruit as a real food dessert. All right, so fruit is going to have beneficial nutrients like a lot of water-soluble vitamins, bioflavonoids, enzymes, fiber, phytonutrients, carotenoids, all in the context of eating this real food source of carbohydrates or real food source of sugar. But we do want to make sure that we're moderating the amount that we consume. All right. Now, if you follow us, if you're in any of our progressions, we have our handouts associated with this that are in our guide where we talk about our safe starches and why we call them safe. We also have our guidelines as far as how much carbohydrates to consume, and then this is also available as a downloadable PDF, all right? The most important point that I want us to take away from this discussion is that not all carbs are created equal, all right? There's a reason that we call our safe starches safe. Real food sources of carbohydrates are going to be way more beneficial for you than non-real food sources of carbohydrates.